Welcome to Chapter 8 in Memory. Memory and learning are very interconnected. We know that we've learned something if we can remember it. This slide and the next 4 slides are an outline of the chapter on memory. We are, in large part, what we remember. Our identity hinges on memory. Memory is the basis for knowing your friends and family, your language, okay, the national anthem, and for knowing about yourself. So if memory was not existent, everyone would be a stranger to you. Every language would be foreign, every task a new task, and even you would be a stranger to yourself. So you'll see a video later in the chapter about a man named Clive Waring who has no access to previous memory and can't form new memory. And you get a sense of how incredibly important memory is to the quality of our life. Unlike our computers, our memory has limitless capacity for remembering information long term. It is helpful to use the analogy of a computer to understand information processing models. So first, we need to get information into our brain. So the analogy of the keyboard, we're typing in information. And then once we get information into our brain, we want to retain it or keep it. So we want to store it on a flash drive, on a file, what have you. Okay, and then let's say after we've studied for a test, we want to be able to retrieve that memory. We want to get it back out. And thus the old time monitor you see on the slide. Atkinson and Shiffrin proposed a model or conceptual framework called the information processing model to explain how memory works. So the first memory stage, it's a 3-stage model, is sensory memory. So sensory memory holds what's seen or heard for a few seconds or less. So right now, look up at your ceiling and then quickly close your eyes and now estimate how long that visual image stayed in your head. Now, for most people, fleeting mental images or icons are held for about 1/2 second. They're very brief. Now, information you hear is held in sensory memory just a bit longer, up to 2 seconds. So an echo is a brief continuation of activity in our auditory system. Okay, so echoic memory. Sensory memory holds information just long enough so that some of the information can be transferred to the next system of memory, which you see on your slide in the green block, working or short-term memory. Okay, those two words are synonymous. We started calling it short-term memory, and now we also call it working memory. And then if we want that information long-term, hopefully it gets encoded into our long-term memory so that we can retrieve it when we need it. So I'll talk about working in long-term memory a bit more on subsequent slides. Some information skips the first 2 stages and enters long-term memory automatically. Since we cannot focus on all sensory information we receive, we're bombarded all day long by information through our various senses. What we do is select information that's important to us, and we actively process it into our working memory. So we have selective attention. Working memory is a newer understanding of short-term memory. It involves conscious, active processing of incoming auditory and visual spatial information, okay, and of information retrieved from long-term memory. So let's say you're taking a chemistry test and you really studied a long time for it, and so you're retrieving from long-term memory what you need, and you're bringing it back into working memory so you can, let's say, work a problem or answer an essay question. We encode in two basic ways. Number one, automatically, and two, effortfully. So some information is automatically processed. So once you drive to school a few times, you hardly have to think about your route to school or your route to your job. Okay, you automatically process that. Doesn't take effort. However, new or unusual information requires attention and effort. If you've never taken a psychology course, most of this information will be new to you, and you'll need to attend and exert some effort to encode the information. A lot of information is processed without effort, such as the following. So space, time, and frequency tend to be automatically processed. So space, while reading a textbook, you automatically encode the place of a picture on a page. So think about that. Probably really easy. Didn't put any effort into trying to memorize where that picture was on the slide. Second, time. We unintentionally note the events that take place in a day. So in the evening, you might say to a friend, I saw our mutual friend Jack right after lunch today. You don't have to think about when you saw him. Number three, frequency. Okay, so automatically you keep track of things that happen to you. So you might come home at night and say to a family member or friend, you know, I saw so-and-so on campus 3 times today. Don't have to think about it much. We just automatically keep track of frequency. Our brains multitask. We have the capacity for parallel processing without conscious attention. So it's hard to turn off parallel processing. It's happening all the time. However, committing new information to memory requires effort, just like learning a concept from a textbook. This kind of processing leads to durable and accessible memory. You all know that effortful learning usually requires rehearsal or conscious repetition. So over the years, you've studied classroom material and you rehearse. You go through your notes again and again, or you make note cards and you rehearse. So back in the 1800s, a man named Hermann Ebbinghaus studied rehearsal. So the only name you need to remember in this chapter is Ebbinghaus. He's known for lots of research on memory and also on forgetting. So in order to study rehearsal, he studied nonsense syllables, a group of letters that he had never seen before. Okay, so these were new to him. So he tested himself. He read a list of nonsense syllables, and the more he repeated the list on day one, the less time he needed to relearn that list on day two. So you can look at the chart on the next slide. So some memory effects. The first is called the spacing effect. So we retain or remember information better when we rehearse it over a period of time. So we call this distributed practice. So ideally in your courses, you learn a little each day. So you take notes during a lecture and you rehearse those before you go to the next lecture, instead of waiting until right before a test and cramming. Okay, so the spacing effect tends to work quite well when it comes to long-term memory. The next memory effect is called the serial position effect. This is when your recall is better for the first and last items on a list, but poor for middle items. Okay, when I do this lecture in class, I give a long list of words and ask students to write down the words they remember, and almost always, most of the students remember the first and the last items, but have a hard time with the middle items because there isn't time for rehearsal. The last items are still in short-term memory, and so they can be recalled as easily as the first items. I want to talk a bit about sleep and memory. So information that's processed seconds before we go to sleep is seldom remembered, and that's because we don't have time to process the information. But information learned an hour or so before sleep is well remembered. So this is a good strategy. An hour or so before you go to sleep, studying can be quite effective. Why? Number one, there's little interference, and two, there's time to rehearse it before you go to sleep. Now, some people claim that taped information played during sleep helps them remember, but this isn't true. We don't have any opportunity to rehearse. We're not conscious. As you now know, given a list of items, the first and last items on a list are best remembered. Okay, the recency effect is when the last items are still in our working memory, so we remember these quite well. The primacy effect occurs after a delay. So if I gave you a list of words to remember and then hours later ask you to remember that word list, recall is generally best for the first items because there is more chance for rehearsal. So what methods help us remember? So researchers, as you've seen on the previous slide, say we encode information in three different ways. We encode by meaning, images, and organization. And so encoding meaning is processing the meaning of verbal information by associating it with what we already know or imagine. Encoding meaning, also known as semantic encoding, results in better recognition later than visual or acoustic memory encoding. Ebbinghaus realized that compared with learning nonsense material, meaningful material required 1/10 the effort. Thus, the more time you spend thinking about the material you're studying and you try to relate it to something previously learned, previously stored in long-term memory, the better you learn. So the amount remembered depends on one, the amount of time spent learning, and number two, making it meaningful. Visual encoding, or encoding by imagery or mental pictures. So imagery is a powerful tool that helps us to process material effortfully, especially when we combine visual encoding with semantic encoding, which is encoding by meaning. So we can talk about the adverse effects of tanning and smoking, but if we combine that with a visual image, as you see on the slide, of a woman on the left who has smoked and tanned for many years versus that same woman on the right without smoking and tanning, it's very powerful and much easier to encode. Now, if I gave you the following list of words to remember: car, idealization, radio, book, theory, which of those words are you most likely to remember? So we encode concrete words, both visually and semantically. So most people are more likely to remember car, radio, and book versus theory or idealization because they're concrete and we can visualize those images. Mnemonics or mnemonic devices. Imagery is at the heart of many memory aids. Mnemonic techniques use vivid imagery and organizational devices in aiding memory. So these were developed by the ancient Greek scholars to remember long passages. They didn't transcribe long passages, and so they would commit them to memory by putting visual images at different places along the area where the wall met the ceiling. And so when they would go to remember the passage, they would look up at that area and remember the visual pictures. So if we were in class, we would do an exercise called the peg word technique that uses auditory and visual memory aids. I think you've used some mnemonic devices probably during grade school and high school, and the next slides will talk about some of those mnemonics. So chunking is a mnemonic device. Chunking is organizing items into a familiar, manageable unit. So if you tried to remember all those numbers on the slide, it would be more difficult than if you chunked them into meaningful dates in American history. So easier to remember 1776, 1492, 1812, 1941 than a list of random 16 digits. Acronyms are another way of chunking. They're used frequently in grade school and high school, and it helps students or anyone remember information. So HOMES, okay, the first letter of each Great Lake. Okay, Roy G. Biv, the first letter of the colors of the rainbow. And you can create your own acronyms. You may be familiar with other acronyms you've used in various classes to remember material. Another tool for remembering complex information are hierarchies. Hierarchies break down information into broad concepts and then subdivide that information into categories and subcategories. So you see on the slide, minerals divided into metals and stones, etc. So general psychology is full of material. One way to go through the slides in your textbook is to create hierarchies for remembering the material. So here's an example of a hierarchy that summarizes encoding. So encoding can be automatic or it can be effortful. And then we subdivide encoding into encoding by meaning, by imagery, and by organization. And when we encode by way of organization, we can do this in chunks or hierarchies. The previous few slides were a review of some of the information I went over earlier in the lecture. So sensory memory, working memory or short-term memory, and long-term memory. So working memory, as you know, is the new name for short-term memory, and it has a limited capacity. We talk about 7 plus or minus 2 items of information that we hold in working memory for a brief duration, about 20 seconds. George Miller talked about the magical number 7 plus or minus 2, showing that there are limits on our capacity for processing information. So if I gave you a long list of letters or numbers, on average, you should be able to remember 5 to 9 letters or 5 to 9 numbers relatively easily. Now, working memory or short-term memory decays pretty rapidly without rehearsal. So you hear something in class or through your PowerPoint slides. If you don't rehearse it until the night before a test, it's almost like starting fresh. And if information isn't meaningful, it's even more quickly lost or dumped. Now, short-term memory is better for random numbers than it is for letters, and short-term memory is better for information we hear versus information we see. So at any given moment, we can consciously process only a very limited amount of information. Unlike short-term memory or working memory, long-term memory is essentially unlimited in its capacity for storing information. So it's not like a file cabinet or a computer that uses up memory capacity. It is thought to be unlimited. This is an interesting slide to take a look at. It comes from World Memory Championship records, speed cards, the shortest time to memorize a shuffled pack of 52 playing cards, 33 seconds. So these are pretty phenomenal feats. So you'll see in the next video the film of Rajan Mahadevan, who's able to remember digits of pi, and it's pretty phenomenal to hear him recite the digits. You may remember from chapter 2 the motor cortex. So a man named William Penfield mapped the motor cortex by electrically stimulating points along the various areas of the cortex, and he came up with the picture of the homunculus. Okay, some of the patients reported flashbacks, but Only a few of Penfield's patients actually were reliving experiences. What most of them were doing were inventing experiences. So people recalled being in places they never visited. So the mind automatically tries to fill in the blanks. Okay, we call this confabulation. We don't store most experiences exactly as they occur. New experience interferes with memory retrieval, and memory traces gradually decay. So Elizabeth Loftus and her husband reviewed Penfield's research data and other data that showed memories were etched into the brain, and found that only a handful of brain-stimulated patients reported flashbacks. Okay. Now, Lashley, another memory researcher, suggested that even after removing parts of the brain, animals retain partial memory of a maze they were trained to run. So they were interested in where our memories are stored. So Lashley removed various parts of the brain, and the rats had partial memory of the maze. So he concluded that memories don't reside in a single specific location in the brain. Memory is distributed across a network of locations. These locations include some of the circuits involved in the original experience. So some brain cells that fire when we experience something fire again when we recall that experience. Two researchers, Kandel and Schwartz, studied sea slugs, or Aphlesia. And they studied the sea slug because it only had 20,000 large nerve cells. So they were easy to observe compared to humans and other animals. And so you may remember they were classically conditioned to flinch when sprayed with water. Water was paired with electric shock. So after classical conditioning, the slug releases more serotonin into some neurons at the synapse. So learning can actually double the number of synapses. So changes occur at the synapse after learning. Experience modifies our neural networks. With learning, neural interconnections form or strengthen, and the synapses become more efficient at transmitting signals. The neurons need less prompting to release neurotransmitters. The strengthening of neural firing potential is called long-term potentiation, or LTP. So it's an increase in neurotransmitter release or receptors on the receiving neuron that indicates strengthening of synapses. The synapses become more efficient at sending signals. In various experiments, memory circuits were rapidly stimulated, and this led to increased sensitivity, in some cases for hours, and in other cases for up to weeks. So LTP provides a neural basis for learning and remembering. Some evidence for this includes the following. One, drugs that block LTP interfere with learning. Two, when rats are given a drug to enhance LTP, they can learn a maze with 1/2 the number of mistakes. So researchers hope that we can one day find a drug to enhance memory. Three, drugs that block neurotransmitters can disrupt information storage. So we know this can happen with alcohol. It impairs memory by disrupting serotonin. So people don't remember what happened after a heavy night of drinking. They have blackouts because the serotonin has been interfered with. Now, an electrical charge won't wipe out old memories, but it will erase recently formed memories. So ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, used for people who don't recover after medication and therapy from depression. Okay, they talk about loss of short-term memory. Football players interviewed right after a blow to the head oftentimes couldn't recall the name of the play during which the blow to the head occurred. So the information in short-term memory did not have time to consolidate into long-term memory. When we're in a state of high emotional arousal, we tend to make stronger memories. So we call these flashbulb memories. Flashbulb memories are clear memories of emotionally significant moments or events. So here you see, destruction after a tornado. It may be your first kiss. It can be something really positive or something catastrophic. So when we're stressed or excited, more glucose energy is available. It fuels brain activity, and there's a hormone surge. Oftentimes, cortisol is released. And the hormones tell the brain that something important has happened. It's as if the emotional arousal burns something into the brain. On the flip side, if people are given drugs to block stress hormones, they later have trouble remembering an upsetting story. So emotion-triggered hormonal changes help explain why we remember exciting or traumatic events quite vividly. Sometimes we experience flashbacks, and that's what we call flashbulb memory, our first kiss, 9/11, etc. So the stronger the emotional experience, the stronger and more reliable the memory. You see on this slide two types of memory, implicit and explicit. Explicit memory refers to facts and experiences that a person can consciously know and declare. So you see on the hierarchical chart below, explicit memory is also called declarative memory. If someone asks you what you've done so far today, you could easily recall that. And so these are memories that have been processed in the hippocampus. Implicit memory involves learning an action while the individual doesn't know or declare what he or she knows. Okay, so this is memory without conscious recall. And this is processed by the cerebellum. So these are oftentimes skills involving motor and cognitive processes, things learned through classical and operant conditioning. Now, where the information ends up in the brain depends on the type of information. And this is illustrated by some cases of amnesia. Okay, amnesia being loss of memory. So there's a famous case of a man named Henry Molaison. For many years before his death, he was known as HM. So HM had a part of his brain removed that involved the formation of new conscious memories of facts and experiences, so explicit memory. So the surgery left old memories intact. He could still do crossword puzzles, but he could not form new memories. What's curious is that someone can learn new things even though they can't form new memory. So when shown hard to find figures in Where's Waldo, a person can quickly spot them later, but they have no awareness of ever having seen the book Where's Waldo. So HM was given a mirror tracing task. So he was given this over many practice sessions, and then they brought out the mirror tracing task to him one day, and he had no memory of ever having seen this or having completed it before. But given the task, he reported saying it was much easier than he thought it would be. So this demonstrates implicit memory. No conscious recall, and yet he could do it more quickly after a series of trials that he didn't remember. So this challenges the idea that memory is a single, unified, conscious system. It seems that we have two systems in operation in tandem. Okay, so a person with amnesia can be read a story once, and then they can read it faster the second time, even though they don't have memory of ever having read the story before. So we can learn how to do new things. You give someone the word or community who has amnesia, and then later you ask what word comes to mind when they see COM, and if you look in the dictionary, many words begin with COM, and most people with this type of amnesia will say community. So after HM's hippocampus was removed in surgery, he could remember everything before the surgery, but was unable to make new memories, as I said in the last slide. And this is what we call anterograde amnesia. I remember this by associating A with after the event, after an injury, after surgery. Okay, there's another type of amnesia called retrograde amnesia. This is when a person loses memory for events and information learned prior to an injury or surgery. So on the next slide, you watch a video about a very bright musician, Clive Wearing, who has both types of amnesia, anterograde and retrograde. So his life is one moment at a time. You'll also see where he has implicit memory. His wife comes in to see him where he's living, and he gets all excited, and he hugs her, and obviously he recognizes her, but when she asks, "Have you seen me before?" he says, "Never." Okay, so a demonstration of implicit memory. So do watch the film. Researchers talk about the three-system model of memory, okay, encoding, storage, and now we're going to look at the third, retrieval. So getting information out after it's stored. So there are two measures of memory, recall and recognition. So see if you remember the person on the left. Do you recall the person on the right? Okay, the person on the left is Oprah Winfrey. The person on the right is Brad Pitt. Now, if you had been given a multiple choice test, most people would remember those people. So recognition is easier than recall. In relearning, a person shows how much time or effort is saved when learning material for the second time. So we remember more than we recall. Memories are held in storage by a web of associations. So these are called retrieval queues. These cues or associations are like anchors that help retrieve memory. So you learn someone's name at a party and you associate it with other information, perhaps what they were wearing, smells at the time, the music that was playing. So later when you go to retrieve the name, these other pieces of information serve as hints or tags, or what we call retrieval cues. So mnemonic devices like Roy G. Biv provide retrieval cues. If we go back to the early days of psychology, William James talked about priming memory. Priming, he said, was the wakening of associations. So to retrieve a specific memory from a web of associations, you must first activate one of the strands that leads to it. And this process is what is called priming. So on the slide, you see seeing or hearing the word rabbit. So it activates the concept of rabbit. Then if someone asks you to spell the word hare, you're likely to spell it H-A-R-E rather than H-A-I-R because your memory has been primed with the concept of a rabbit or a hare, H-A-R-E. In one study, a researcher had scuba divers listen to a list of words in two different settings. In one setting, they were 10 feet underwater, and in the second setting, they were sitting on a beach. The subjects later recalled more words when they were tested in the same setting where they learned the list, and this is what is known as context effects. So your textbook talks about studying at your desk. So you get up to sharpen a pencil, you go downstairs, and you forget what you came down to do. So you go back to your desk, and at your desk, you remember what you needed to do. So the context primes your memory. Déjà vu means I've experienced this before. So sometimes being in a context similar to one we've been in before triggers the déjà vu experience. And this happens most commonly to well-educated, imaginative young adults, especially when they're tired or stressed. So 60% of people reported having had at least one déjà vu experience. So context effects trigger the déjà vu. More about context effects. You see the picture in the slide of a baby learning to move a mobile by kicking. So when they retest infants, they most strongly respond when they're retested in the same context rather than in a different context. So a student some years ago decided he was going to use the context effect research to improve his learning and memory. So he lived on campus and he would go back to the classroom in the evening in which he learned the material and studied in the same context. And at the end of the semester, he reported an increase, a significant increase in his GPA. So context effects. We usually recall experiences that are consistent with our current mood. So we call this state-dependent memory. So our emotions or moods serve as retrieval cues. So if we're depressed, the depression may sour our memories and it may prime negative associations. A person may remember his parents as being critical and rejecting when he was a child. And when a person is happy, the same person might remember their parents differently. They might see their parents in a much more positive light. So our memories are mood congruent. Researchers have looked at why we forget. At what points in the memory system can our memory fail us? So forgetting is defined as an inability to retrieve information due to poor encoding, storage, or retrieval. So we may fail to remember something because we did not encode it to begin with. When I teach this course in class, I show students about 10 pictures of a penny and ask people to identify the penny as it exists. And the majority of students do not get the correct penny. And the reason for this is that they never pay close enough attention to a penny. They didn't encode all the details, and so it never got into long-term memory. So they're unable to retrieve that information. Now, as we age, we encode more slowly. Older people recall less than younger people, but when given cues or reminders or a test of recognition, they do as well as younger people. So Ebbinghaus not only studied learning, he also studied forgetting. And he demonstrated that much of what we learn, we forget quite quickly. So forgetting is initially rapid, and then it levels off over time, as you see on the graph. So you learn something, and by day 1, after you've learned it, the retention drops from almost 60% to 30%, and then to about 25% in the second or third day, and then it more or less levels off. So again, memory decay can happen in storage, as Ebbinghaus demonstrated. In 1984, Baric showed a similar pattern of forgetting and retaining a foreign language over 50 years. So you see initially, after the first couple of years, the retention of the vocabulary rapidly drops, and then it levels off over the next 40 some years. Forgetting can also occur as a result of retrieval failure. So even though the information is retained in long-term memory, we cannot access it. So this is retrieval failure. Many people have the TOT phenomenon. The tip of the tongue is a retrieval failure. Okay, if you give someone a cue, let's say you say, what makes blood cells red? And the subject says the word begins with an H, then they can come up with hemoglobin. So oftentimes a technique for remembering something is to go through the alphabet. The alphabet can serve as a retrieval cue if we're trying to remember something. Sometimes we forget because of interference. Okay, new information can make it harder to recall something you learned earlier. Now, sleep prevents retroactive interference. If you learn something, let's say, an hour or so before you go to sleep, then your sleep will prevent that type of retroactive interference, so it leads to better recall. So retroactive is backward acting interference. On this slide, you see an example of proactive interference. So this is forward-acting interference. What you learned before interferes with your current learning. So you learned French beforehand, and it's interfering with your current studying of Spanish. Proactive interference. So we have both retroactive and proactive interference as sources of forgetting. However, old learning and new learning don't always compete. There is a phenomenon known as positive transfer. And so in positive transfer, previously learned material can help us learn new material. So, for example, Latin helps us learn French. Sigmund Freud believed that people are motivated to forget. So people unknowingly revise their memories so that they can live with less anxiety. So he talks about a defense mechanism called repression. And repression banishes anxiety-arousing thoughts, feelings, and memories from consciousness. So you said something really hurtful to someone and you feel bad about that and you repress it so that you can move forward without as much anxiety. Many memory specialists now believe repression rarely happens, that when people have traumatic experiences, they oftentimes have difficulty forgetting or repressing those traumatic experiences. Researchers have been interested in the accuracy of our memories. So while tapping our memories, we tend to filter or fill in missing pieces of information to make our recall more coherent. I talked previously about confabulation. Now, a researcher named Elizabeth Loftus investigated what she called the misinformation effect. This is when a person incorporates misleading information into one's memory of an event. Elizabeth Loftus and her associates conducted over 200 experiments with over 20,000 subjects on misinformation and imagination effects. In one experiment, subjects were shown a film of a car accident, okay, and then the subjects were asked questions. Group A in this experiment were asked how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. The subjects in Group B were asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. Okay, so the change in wording had an impact on their answers. As you can imagine, Group B gave higher speed estimates. In the same experiment, a week later, subjects were asked, was there any broken glass? Group B, the smashed into group, reported more glass than Group A, the hit group. Interestingly enough, there was no glass in the original film. After subtle exposure to misinformation, many people misremember. So this is memory construction or the misinformation effect. When people are given misinformation, later it can be difficult to discriminate between real and suggested events. So a researcher named Piaget had a nanny who brought him home one day from the park and told his parents, he was a little toddler at the time, that he was almost abducted, and she beat off this person with her umbrella and saved Piaget. So when Piaget was an adult, one day the nanny came to his door. He hadn't seen the nanny in many years, and she said she had a confession to make, that she told his parents that he was nearly abducted in order to look good in his parents' eyes, when in fact that never happened. And he was taken aback because he thought he had a very clear memory of that event. Elizabeth Loftus did some experiments with teenage boys who were instructed to take their younger brothers to a mall. And they could do anything with their brothers, but she did not want them to buy the brothers ice cream. So after some time elapsed, she asked these younger boys if they remembered an event that did not happen, That is getting an ice cream. And most of the boys said yes. Later, the boys were told that this was fabricated, but the boys insisted that the event was real. As memory fades over time, the injection of misinformation becomes easier. Okay, we fill in memory gaps, oftentimes unknowingly, with assumptions and plausible guesses. So, given time, the mind's search for a fact may create a fiction. So, memory construction explains, number one, why hypnotically refreshed memories of crime scenes include errors, some because of the hypnotist leading question. Was there a loud noise? Did you hear screeching brakes? Okay, it also explains why dating partners who fall in love later overestimate their first impressions. They construct memories that don't fit reality. And it explains why those who break up underestimate their initial impressions. So, memory construction. The weakest or frailest part of memory is the source. So, for example, we recognize someone, but we don't remember where we know them from. Or we dream or imagine an event, and later we're not sure if it really happened. We retain an image, but forget the source or the original context. So in your book, there's a story of a psychologist who was working on memory. His name was Donald Thompson, and he was brought into questioning by authorities for a rape. But he had a near perfect alibi. He had an airtight alibi. Uh, he was a near perfect match to the victim's memory of the rapist, but it turned out that just before the rape happened, he was being interviewed about face recognition on live television. Somewhat ironic. So later it came to light that the rape victim had been watching that TV interview, and when she was questioned by the police, she described the man she saw on TV. So she experienced source amnesia. Children's eyewitness recall can be unreliable if leading questions are asked. So for example, where did the doctor touch you? Did the doctor touch you in your private parts? What we know is that cognitive interviews, if neutrally worded, increase the accuracy of recall. In cases of sexual abuse, this usually suggests a lower percentage of abuse. Over the years, there's been a lot of controversy about childhood abuse, sexual and physical abuse. Researchers have wondered if memories of abuse can be repressed or can they be constructed. So the consensus on child abuse is the following. Okay, abuse does occur. Okay, but some people forget. Recovered memories are commonplace in people who are victims of abuse, but we need to be careful about memories recovered under hypnosis or drugs. They're unreliable. And we also know that memories of things that happened to us prior to age 3 are unreliable because we don't have full verbal access for encoding certain events. Memories, whether real or false, are emotionally upsetting. So we need to keep that in mind. So this chapter has given you a lot of practical ideas about how to study better to boost your memory. So repeated study and rehearsal boost long-term recall. So we talk about distributed practice. If you study over a period of time, you'll remember better than if you cram right before a test. Also, making material personally meaningful will enhance long-term recall. Mnemonic devices can be helpful, making up stories, making up a song, chunking, using acronyms, etc. Activate retrieval cues. So mentally recreate the situation where you learned or studied and recreate the mood. So you may not be able to study in the classroom where you learn the material, but as you're taking a test or writing an essay, you might, in your mind's eye, recall where it was you learned the material to create some context effects. Recall events while they're fresh before you encounter misinformation or have the experience of interference. So you want to minimize interference. Test your own knowledge, rehearse, and determine what you don't know yet.